Welcome to ParaTruthers. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to ParaTruth Reborn. My name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
And today we are going to be talking about some pretty deep stuff in regards to the scientific and spiritual community. This is something that's been kind of coming up more and more often, especially through social media programs such as TikTok and occasionally Instagram as well. And that, in particular, is the idea of the timeline shifts. Timeline shifting is something that we've talked about many times over the years, but lately it's become more and more, I guess more and more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Talked about?
I guess talked about. There's another word I was trying to think of, but
More and more prevalent?
Yes, prevalent. That's the word I was looking for. I had all these P words in my mind, but I could not think of that one. Becoming more and more prevalent over this last year or so, especially between 2023 and 2024. So with that said, as we get into the show, there are a number of things we're going to be talking about, and I would like to give everyone some clear definitions as to some of these things that we're going to discuss. And that is the definitions and ideas of the timeline shifts, of dimensions, of what a timeline and a dimension is, and of course, a couple of little things regarding the differences between timelines and dimensions. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and do that for us so that everybody's on the same page, and it'll help you understand what we're talking about, and even allow you the opportunity to dial in and, hit us with some messages later on to get a little more of your feedback as to everything we're sharing. So with that said, the first thing I want to share is exactly what a timeline is. Now, it's pretty simple. A timeline is a way to visualize historical events or actions that occur over a specific period of time. Pretty self-explanatory. You got history or the past on the left side, and on the right side, you've got the future, and in between is everything else up until this very moment, which is the present, right? A dimension, on the other hand, is the different facets of what we perceive to be reality. Any one of the three physical or spatial properties of length, area, and volume. Now, with that said, knowing what a timeline is and what a dimension is, we get into this idea of the timeline shift and the dimensional shift. So a timeline shift, and bear with me, it's a little long, it basically involves perceiving, sensing, visualizing, imagining, or feeling the reality shift or change around you. According to a number of spiritualists, and scientists, this can happen on its own, such as in the case of the Mandela effect, in which something such as a name, event, or widely held understanding or belief is suddenly contradicted by new information of any of the aforementioned that most people don't recall. There's also a belief that a person can choose new realities, which you can then create with your own intended focus. But of course, in such cases, this sort of change in reality affects only one person, yourself, and can be done in any number of ways, such as getting a new career, completing your degree, or moving locations. So finding that perfect balance between what exactly timeline shift is, how it affects the world versus how it affects yourself, and whether there's anything truly spiritual about it, because we can easily change our own timeline by doing some physical things, such as the new job or the career or, whatever. A dimensional shift now is a phenomenon whereby an object or person is transported from one location to another via folded space transport or shifted to a parallel universe on a different dimensional plane. Now, this is something we'll probably get into a little later in the show in regards to different dimensional planes, as well as parallel timelines and parallel universes. It's a mind bogger, but it's going to be a really fun discussion for sure. Now, with all of that said, knowing what a timeline is, what a dimension is, what a timeline shift is, and what a dimensional shift is, it is important, I believe, to know that timeline refers to the linear flow of time and events. Universe refers to the physical locations where the events take place. And dimensions, in this case, are different locations within those universes. So those are things that are very important to understand, and it's something you're probably going to want to think about a little as we continue on with today's episode. So with that said, Justin, obviously I've kept you, not on purpose, quiet over there for a little bit, but one of the big questions and one of the reasons that we've decided to talk about timeline shifts is because the number of videos that have been posted on TikTok specifically of various people asking or claiming that we are sensing some sort of shift, that something is happening. Now, you and I have talked about this a lot on our own, off air.
Mm-hmm.
What do you believe regarding some of these videos or all these videos? I mean, what kind of significant evidence is there in regard to a timeline shift for people as a whole?
I don't know that there is a whole lot of evidence to say the whole of humanity has shifted timelines. The one thing I've always seen, and this is where it gets very speculative and not that there's any evidence to it at all, is that each individual can timeline shift, not humanity as a whole. That's not to say we haven't. It's just in all of these videos, they're basically saying you can shift timelines, not humanity can shift timelines. You can shift timelines by changing your perception, your trying to get to your best timeline by shifting your personal beliefs and what have you. So there really is no evidence per se, except for, like you had mentioned, there's Mandela effects, and there's even some new ones that I looked up that we'll talk about a little bit later. So in my mind, the only way that you're going to know that you've shifted timelines is if you notice something very specific that has changed. Timeline shifts can be like super subtle. And, you know, you've mentioned, you and I have had these conversations off air too. I've felt major changes. What those are, I can never really pinpoint. But I feel like something has changed. And that has to do with, you know, spiritual growth, where you're at in your journey, stuff like that, as if you feel it. Because there's plenty of people that probably have no idea what we're talking about too.
For sure. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to get your perspective on it, because sometimes I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like saying a timeline shift is sort of a new age way of saying changing your personal surroundings, your life, by doing something different from what you continuously do, right? Many of us fall into this repetition in life. You know, we do the same thing every morning, every afternoon, every evening. We have routines. With that said, timelines don't really change. There's no such thing as changing a timeline because we don't know what the future timeline is. So how can we know we're changing a timeline if we don't know the end? However, we can change certain areas or aspects of our life, such as, normally I brush my teeth at 10 o'clock at night. Maybe today I'm going to do it at 8 o'clock at night and stay up a little later to watch TV. Well, now you've made a little small change that can have a significant impact, such as if you're watching TV a little later, you might sleep worse, and therefore tomorrow is going to be a harder day. Whereas if you step back and go to sleep earlier, well, you may wake up more refreshed and have more energy and have a better perspective on life, rather than falling into some sort of depressed or negative aspect on life. Like, there are various ways that we can change our lives, and we see it time and time again, actually, especially over the last several years, where people are becoming very more aware of themselves because they are taking the opportunity to seek counseling and talk to people to help better themselves and better their lives. that I wouldn't say is necessarily a change of quote unquote timelines, but you're just simply bettering yourself, which changes the past version of yourself and creates a new version of yourself, all based on one's own perspective. So I think in my personal opinion, I do think the idea of changing timelines is a little out there, and that people are using it as kind of like a hook to try to draw people into this more new agey perspective, if you will. Nothing wrong with it, but it's just something I think it's like another or a new way to try to draw people in and get them thinking differently from what they would normally think.
Well, a lot of people are using it as a hook, but same thing with the Mayan calendar ending in 2012, and then people are like, no, it's actually 2021 because the numbers are imposed on each other. Basically, that particular instance, people were using end of day prophecy to change what it was they were trying to say when the end of the world is coming, which you and I both know, regardless of your religious beliefs, you're never going to know when the end of the world is coming because we have no control over that. But some people have said that 2020 was a timeline shift for all of humanity, where we've shifted into a timeline where we're gonna have more pandemics, more lockdowns, things of that nature. And then in 2023, people were saying, "Oh no, we've shifted again." And even 2024, there are people that saying, "No, we've all shifted into the timeline where we're going to be entering the 5D reality. Things are getting better. You'll see, blah blah blah." Nobody has in any of their videos given specific reasons why they're saying that. They're just saying things have shifted, things have changed. So yes, I do agree that a lot of these people that are making videos are using it as a hook. Is it reality where we're shifting timelines? Yeah, don't know. There's no real evidence to say for sure you're shifting into a better timeline or anything like that. Like I mentioned, for me personally, it's a feeling. I can't pinpoint what's changed because in my mind, everything seems kind of the same except for the external reality of, events happening in our reality. But that can, isn't that an explanation of the changing of times in general?
Right. And that is something that, as you know, I too have experienced this. I mean, how many times have I texted you and said, dude, do you feel off? Like something feels off, right? And I don't know why. I don't know what the reason is. I can't say that there's certain vibrations within the earth or the universe or the timeline or whatever that are affecting me, or if it's something else entirely. Like humanity, and depending on who you are too, within humanity, your personal being, some of us can feel things differently than others. I'm the type that actually, I just talked about this. It was brought up over my vacation, my trip to North Carolina this summer. And we would constantly, like the house would constantly that we were in would sway back and forth just throughout the entire week, even when there weren't heavy gusts of wind. And it's built on stilts. So it naturally has a flexion to it, right? So that it would sway and not just snap and fall over. However, only 3 of the 8 or 9 people in that house felt it. Me, my sister, and my dad. Everyone else never felt the house move at all. And one thing that was brought up from my sister was how I am one of those people who always tend to feel things better and more greatly than others. Like, I feel, this is going to sound weird, but I feel like my insides, I could feel little shifts and moves, whether it's, in the gut or a joint or just little tiny bubbles like under the skin from being like cramped up and stuff. They're just like little effects that I feel that most people don't feel on a regular basis. So I'm kind of more in tune to these little movements in natural life. And so it's possible, with that said, that events such as a solar eclipse, which happened earlier this year, that was one of those moments where I felt like things were starting to shift or change, could have been nothing more than a gravitational change. Something within the, this alignment of the earth and the sun and the moon. Also, there are things like lunar eclipses, or whether the moon is full or new, whether there are various stones. Like, where are you at? Are you on, standing on granite? Are you standing on, some sort of mineral type rock that has different energy sources? Who knows? There's all kinds of these different little things that could affect people differently. And some people who tend to feel those things more so than others may recognize or believe this to be some sort of timeline shift or something happening within the universe, when in reality, it's just the natural geological or astrological process of daily life and daily living. One thing that you did say was that 2020, many people thought that seemed like a big shift, a change in the timeline where things are going to change. And I think in many ways you're right. Again, I want to just make this aware to everybody, at least for me when I'm speaking. I'm using this idea of timeline shift very vaguely. My belief is that life just happens, right? Whatever we do, we can make changes, this, that. Whether or not it changes the destination for us in the future, we will never know until that day comes. Right. So whether or not you're really changing timelines is insignificant, and there's really no scientific evidence to support that. It's all theoretical. However, thinking of 2020 and the things that had changed kind of reminded me in many ways, and we've talked about this before, of the Black Plague, which took place between 1346 and 1353. Now, prior to the Black Plague, people weren't very concerned about illness. It wasn't something that we took, as a daily living of being washed up and using soap and various things to keep good, keep hygienically clean and stuff like that, right? People would often take baths once every month or every few months in some cases, even once a year, depending on your living situations. As a result, this plague kind of broke out, and it wasn't just in essence due to a disgusting living area at the time, but it had a lot to do with superstition as well, as we've talked about in the past, which is in this case, people who are afraid of witchcraft and believe that cats, especially black cats, were basically these servants or familiars of witches. And so they went around killing cats like crazy, a mass homicide of cats. And the result of those cats dying was the uprising, if you will, of rats from the sewers and from below the streets who were carrying this plague and started spreading the plague around to humanity, and thousands and thousands. I mean, roughly somewhere near a third of humanity died during that time, which is incredibly insane. And it was a realization that cats are very important to life at the time. And even today in some areas, they would kill the rats who carried these diseases, and therefore the rats would never come in contact with humanity. Same thing happened in a way with 2020, with what do they call it? What is that called? What was the illness?
COVID. You just had it.
See, my timeline shifted. In my timeline, COVID never existed, so I didn't know what it was. Yeah. So COVID obviously didn't come out in the same way by any means. There's a lot of speculation as to how it came about. But what we do know is the result of COVID, and that is that sanitizer uprise in sales, right? With hand sanitizer. People wear when they're sick or they're not feeling well, or when they don't want to be sick, they tend to wear their N95 masks or any masks to cover their mouths and their nose, because we realized over those course of 3 years, I don't know about anybody else, many of you were probably off in your house for nearly 2 years. I was not. I was working at a store in the public eye. I was an essential worker, so I was out there every single day, but I was wearing a mask. And over those 2 years in which COVID, an illness which was widespread, killing thousands of people around the world, never once touched me. In fact, I never got sick from COVID or never had a cold, didn't have any sort of allergies at all for 2 years because I was wearing a mask on a daily basis. And it was that realization of how when we protect ourselves, such as just our mouth and our nose, or we intake, when we breathe in and take spores or whatever, you can protect yourself. Like we've come to this new realization of how or how to keep ourselves healthier going forward. And that's not to say there are still issues. Obviously, in America, it's a little easier. In certain countries, it's a little easier. When we're talking about third world countries and stuff like that, obviously, very different story. But nonetheless, that would, in this case, be, as you said, a change within the timeline. We became more aware of our weaknesses as humans, how easily we can be basically killed by a virus, which is very closely related to the regular flu bug. And we're able to find ways to, quote unquote, evolve around it by masking ourselves or using more sanitizer, washing our hands more regularly.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't catch COVID till 2021 for the first time. But I mean, that's what I'm saying, though. Like any major world event could be taken as a timeline shift. Look at 9/11. That was a huge timeline shift if you're looking at it from that perspective, because so much changed after that for the U.S. specifically. As far as TSA and the much more stringent checkpoint, getting through checkpoints in the airports and stuff like that. A lot changed then too. Right. So I like I said, I am skeptical in that regard as far as timeline shift, even reality shift. But like you've mentioned it to me. I've even mentioned it to you that something's changed. Don't know what it is. Something's off. I can't tell what it is. Right. Is that a timeline shift? I don't know, but something's weird. And you were mentioning all the different things that you pick up on. Humanity picks up on when we have solar flares, like major solar flares happening, because it hits our magnetic field and throws off the entire world, because it's just one of those things that we can't control. So to kind of wrap up the whole timeline shift thing, I don't know for timeline shifting individually or as humanity. And we'll probably talk about that same exact thing as far as moving into 5D reality or 5D world. But unfortunately, it's just like anything else in the paranormal. There's no scientific evidence to say 100%. And mainstream science probably will never say that anything in the paranormal or anything that's being talked about in the paranormal, occult, whatever circles, is scientifically proven. Even if you give them 100 different pieces of evidence, they're still going to say, well, that's circumstantial. Right.
Well, with that said, and before moving on to our next little segment here, I do want to mention, as we've talked about, there are certain people or groups of people who believe that a timeline shift is something that not only one can do on their own, but is actually something that can affect more than just one person. Making the decision to get a new job, for example, because your old one or current one sucks, that's a good feeling when you succeed and get that job. You move forward, you get something new, right? However, there is this belief in certain circles where you can actually feel, as we've talked about, various vibrations or whatever, but you can feel certain physical symptoms that can allow you to know or have some sort of idea maybe that there is a timeline shift or reality shift happening presently. And so I'd like to go through just some of these things, and I'm not going to talk about much of them. These are pretty self-explanatory. So these are just some different, we'll say circumstances in which one might consider, hey, maybe I'm going through a timeline shift. So the first one sign for a timeline shift is vertigo. Now, I don't know about everybody else. I tend to experience vertigo a lot, but I also am prone to migraines. So that tends to be an issue. I've got a lot of head things happening, unfortunately. But vertigo is one that many people think, when you're walking around, you feel off balance. There might be a shift somewhere within the timeline that throws you physically in some way. The next one is...
I think for that one specifically, it's more so if you've never experienced vertigo before, or if you don't experience it that often.
Right.
However, it doesn't mean anything when you experience vertigo, technically speaking.
With that said, also, I want to say that some of these things, you're going to see that some of these things are physical, could be physical ailments. And if it's happening frequently, I don't want you to just think, oh, timeline change.
Yeah.
You should consider maybe seeing a doctor. Right. Legitimately. Like, I'm not saying that just to be a jerk. Like,
no.
If you're I agree. Going through vertigo or spacing out or whatever, and it's happening very regularly, you should probably just get checked just to make sure.
I mean, even psychic mediums will tell you a reading, but they will also tell you, please don't take my word for it. Please talk to your doctor if you think I'm even close to accurate.
Right. All right. So the first one's vertigo. I'm just going to run through these quickly here. The first one is vertigo. The second is spatial disorientation. The third is spacing out. So you'll notice that those first three are they all kind of relate in some way. Mm-hmm. The fourth is a sudden physically felt shift in the timeline. This is a weird one. How do you know that you're feeling a physical shift in timeline? Now, it's almost a sensation, apparently, it's almost a sensation of being physically moved and settled into a new timeline. Like your body is suddenly shifted or placed to the left or right or front or back of a new space. Okay. The fifth is different memories than others. We're going to get more into this a little later when we talk about the Mandela effect some more. And the sixth is facts changing from the past. Again, this is going to go along with the Mandela effect that we're going to talk about a little later. And then we got the seventh, which is the final one, which again, that lines up here, changes in people, events, or how you experience the world. Again, this last one I think is probably the most significant here. Changes in people, you can't really control that. People change. It's a normal thing. How you experience the world is also something that can have huge impacts on your life. If you're someone who's a negativist and you see the world with a bleak, dark worldview, but then suddenly you have this beautiful, bright outlook on the world, it's going to be a huge night and day difference. Mm-hmm. So that's something to consider. As for changes in events, again, that is something that will kind of lines up with the Mandela effect and some of those other world changing things that we'll discuss. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into our next little segment here, this next part of this timeline shift discussion, and we will discuss the 5D world. The 5D world it's an interesting concept, and it's something that one can argue has happened many times over the last century or two. So what is the 5D world? Well, in essence, the 5D lies in its detachment from the physicality of the 3D, offering a spiritually awakened experience that brings people more healing, karmic clearing, and balance to our souls. It's almost a transformative phase. The planet's energy seems to vibrate higher and brings more light and exposing the shadows within ourselves and within our society. So basically what we're saying here is you have a 3D world, which is, as I said earlier, it's basically 3 dimensions. It's what you see, what you hear, what you taste, feel, etc. It's everything around you, right? You're living in a 3D world. A 5D world is everything spiritual or beyond the physical realm. These are things that we can't see or touch or talk to on a daily basis, but something that we can maybe become a little more intuitive with. This is a big part of meditation, is kind of opening yourself up to this quote unquote 5D world, expanding your mind and trying to absorb energies or ideas outside of the physical space that you're in.
There have been some people that have said, I don't remember if it was 2022 or 2023, that the Earth was splitting into the 3D and 5D world, depending on your vibrational level. you would either end up staying on the 3D reality or shift into the 5D reality. Something that I had heard, and this kind of goes with spirituality, and I'm not saying that this is exactly, but there were people saying that, you know, the 5D world is actually the world of Jesus's return, you know, us living in the same realm as God, that is kind of prophesized in the Bible and stuff like that. Not saying that's what I believe. That's just what some people had said. You know, people had mentioned that if you've shifted to the 5D world, you will be in a 3D body for a while, and then you will evolve into a being of light. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember all of it. I didn't actually look this part up. But I did find a list of how to tell if you've shifted into the 5D. I'm sure you probably looked up one too. But again, it's one of those things that there's no scientific proof to say this actually happened. There's no scientific proof to show that you have shifted into one way or the other, except for these lists that people have made up saying, well, if this happened or is happening to you, you've probably shifted into the 5D world. Just like Eric mentioned about the timeline shifts, there have been tons of people coming out with TikTok videos, YouTube videos saying you've shifted. If you're seeing this on your timeline, you shifted. Yeah, I don't know if that's how it works. If we have shifted into the 5D world, I'm waiting for this whole time of peace and prosperity and all this stuff. So if it's coming, I hope it is coming. But again, scientifically speaking, there's no real way from mainstream science to say that we've shifted one way or the other.
Right. You know, the whole discussion of the 3D to the 5D is really just the difference between the physical everyday living that we do versus the spiritual living that we focus on, whether through meditation or prayer or otherwise. There's a lot of discussions regarding what 5D really is. Like, is it a physical place? Is it somewhere where only our minds exist? Is it, is it something that we can touch, or is it something that we can only, what's it called? Like spiritual project into in some way, you know? Is it simply prayer? You know, like there are times, I think, even in the Christian life where one can argue, and mind you, the 5D state here, the 5D world is more of another new age or occult-like idea. But if you take it under Christian terms, in this case for myself, one can argue that the 5D world is a spiritual path in which we walk closer to Jesus, you know, the God of the universe. Some will argue that God lives in the 5D, that heaven is the 5D. And there's really no way to get there without dying and your spirit going to heaven should you be accepted, based on God's grace. But that leaves us with this idea of something in between. You know, we talk about the 3D, we talk about the 5D, but rarely do we ever hear about the 4D. Like, what is a 4D world? And it's something that you and I have never really discussed. So really the difference between the 3D and 5D is simply the 4D. It's a mashup of the two. A 4D world is a case in which you start to have a spiritual awakening. You can kind of sit in a meditative state and see into a spiritual side of realm, if you will. You start to feel a difference, a heavy presence, or a good presence. It's not heavy, but like a good light presence, good vibes, if you will, right? But you can easily detach and come back to the 3D world, awaken from your meditation, and boom, they're right here. it is believed that once you enter the 5D, there is no coming back to the 3D. At least it's not easy to come back to the 3D, which is why no one has done such a thing. It's not evident. In fact, the only person to literally, and I'm going to use this as, I don't like using this as a reference, but it's the best I can use to kind of give people a understanding here. Jesus from heaven, if we argue that 5D is heaven, came down to earth in human form, the 3D world. And he lived in between the two for 33 years, living life as a human, but also 100% as God, leading people to come to salvation and learn the ways of Christ and of his Father in heaven and of the Holy Spirit. And then when he died, he committed his spirit to God, went back to heaven, the 5D, if you will, only to then send his spirit back down into the 3D. And the spirit is the intercessor between humanity and God, for those who believe. And therefore the spirit would live in this 4D realm, being God, but living here on earth. Again, that's taking a very, in this case, an ancient concept of Christianity, which is it's Christianity, and applying it to a new world idea of 3D, 4D, and 5D, right? I don't think Jesus would ever come to earth and be like, oh yeah, so heaven's the 5D, this is 3D. Spirit, he's cool, he lives within the 4D. You guys get it? Cool, boom, call. I'm gonna go back to heaven, right? It's not how it works. But that's the best way I can kind of explain it. Like that's the only person, Jesus is the only person who has gone to the 5D in this case and returned. Humans don't do that. People don't do that. There is yet to be a single person to come forth and say, and if they have, they've been disproven. There have been a number of false prophets, if you will, who've claimed to be living at a higher level, only to often be falling into all sort of nonsense that are, and I use the term sin lightly because not everyone here is believers, but there are things that many of those prophets who claim to be similar to Jesus have fallen into, which has even been detestable to people who are complete atheists, who don't believe in right or wrong or good or bad, and yet are like, whoa, that's bad, right? So I don't know. I mean, it's just, I think the whole concept of 5D, 4D, and 3D is a very broad thing, and it's something that we can only begin to wrap our heads around by meditation and studying the ideas. Unfortunately, it is still very all theoretical. But
from a secular standpoint, from how I've heard some people explain it, the 3D, 4D, and 5D worlds, 3D is basically what we are living in now, or what we were living in, depending on what you're believing. 4D is actually time. So we go from a linear time living in 3D reality. We surpass 4D, surpassing time itself, going into 5D where we live, where time is not a measured thing. It's all circular, not linear, as a lot of people do believe. But we've even heard in science, like quantum science, that time is not linear. It is all existing all at the same time. So it can scientifically be proven in a sense of quantum science, even though quantum science is still kind of a quasi area of science right now. That's not to say that we have changed from 3D to 5D or anything like that. It's just what's been explained that I've heard before. And moving into that 5D world, you're not going to experience time. You're going to experience all time, or I should say 3D time. You're going to experience time as a circular thing where you don't age. You've kind of transcended that physical reality. Like Eric was saying, you're living in a more spiritual reality. So again, as Eric said, all theoretical. There's nothing that's saying one has happened over the other. It really boils down to what you're seeing, what you're believing, what you're feeling.
All right. I will, before moving on here, I will leave it at this. The 5D is only halfway through the realms of the dimensions supposedly available. 10D is apparently the highest that one can ever achieve. And that is, in this case, where God exists. This is a particular person whose energy is part of and can manifest everything within the galaxies and the universe. And considering the fact that God spoke creation into existence would suggest, or actually easily argue, that this 10D world, should it even exist and such, would be where he lives. So we're not going to get into it, but after 5D, you go to 6D and 7D, which are similar, though separate in a way. And then the higher states of 8D, 9D, and 10D are basically areas in which you can simply have a thought and just distribute your energy, go anywhere in the universe you want to, in a physical sense. And that's it. Like you just wouldn't exist ever in the 3D realm again. Your body and everything would just disperse, and you would, in a sense, become a god, which, of the thousands of years, millions for some people, who, whatever you believe in regards to, the life of Earth and humanity, I guess, never once had I ever heard of anyone just, being absorbed into the universe on their own accord. But nonetheless, hey, these are some speculative things that are very interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, so we'll go over this list I found for if you've shifted into the 5D world, how to tell. Number 1, daily life will be bubbling frequently with sensations of gratitude, joy, lightness, love, and wonder. Like Eric mentioned with the timeline shifts, that can just be changing your perspective on life too. Number 2, heavy negative emotional issues that you're carrying release easier and quicker. You will physically experience the world as being more alive and beautiful with your senses. Unless you catch COVID, and then that's a completely separate thing. Number 4, time will feel fluid, eternal, and illusory. You'll constantly have unexplained synchronistic experiences, and miraculous manifestations will happen more regularly. Number 6, you will know and feel divinely guided by something higher than your own mind or imagination. Number 7, you start to access the miraculous powers of your true multidimensional body. Very, very similar to the timeline shift list, but this kind of, where the timeline shift had a little more physical manifestations. This is more of a enlightened or spiritual, like we've been talking about with the 5D changes.
Yeah. A lot of what you said is very similar to, really anyone of any faith who's claimed the closer you are to God, the stronger you become in a spiritual sense. And I know, like, in the Christian faith, that's one thing, is the more you submit to God and restrict yourself from sin or battle against it, the more enlightened and the stronger you become, and the more his power can be pushed through you, the more the Holy Spirit can do through you. The biggest difference, though, according to what you just read, and someone who is a Christ follower, is that as a Christ follower, it is God who does everything through that person. So though they become enlightened and they become more aware of themselves and the world and the idea of light and love and everything, it is still God working through them. Whereas what you were talking about is that these individuals can hit a place or achieve a place in which they can create miracles and do things on their own, of their own accord, within the human realm.
Within the 5D realm.
Within the 5D realm, which is still, in this case, more or less.
Well, I mean, there would be those that say once you move to 5D, you're not even really human.
Right.
At that point. But with that being said, I think this is a good point where we can go to break. So, folks, you've been listening to ParaTruth. We will be right back right after this.
Welcome back to ParaTruth. As always, my name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
And today we are talking about the timeline shifts that have had picked up relatively recently a lot of traction on the TikTok and social media world. Now, we've covered a lot here between timeline shifts and dimensional shifts, the differences between the two. We talked about a 3D, 4D, and 5D realm. As promised earlier, there were a couple of things that could happen that we've all witnessed over the last couple of years. And that is certain changes within our environments or within history that we don't quite recollect. Things that seem different compared to what we previously believed. And that's where this idea of the Mandela effect comes into play. The Mandela effect is something very intriguing. It has always been intriguing. The first time I think I really heard of the Mandela effect or really started to grasp its potency was probably back in like 2013, 2012, 2013. Back then we were talking about the Bernstein Bears. That's when it was most popular. And this idea of the Mandela effect popped up. And ever since then, that idea has gained traction and more things have been shown to kind of link with this effect. And that is that something that not just one person, but a majority of people who believed one thing within the past suddenly is contradicted by new information that rewrites history or seems to rewrite history. So lately you said that there have been new things that have popped up within the Mandela effect, and that can kind of help with this whole idea of understanding the timeline shifts. So why don't you give us some of those things and we can talk about how that could be changing anything?
Well, the first one, and this is one that I've mentioned to you, is Richard Simmons passing away.
Right.
I remember him passing away several years ago, but he actually just recently passed away. Something that is a little bit subtle is the Starbucks logo. How do you remember the Starbucks logo? With the crown.
The Starbucks with the crown?
Well, the Starbucks logo has always had a crown, but what is specific to you in your mind when it comes to the Starbucks logo with the crown on the mermaid?
I don't have one about the crown on the mermaid.
Okay.
I just think I only ever think of the mermaid and then what to me is like two waves on the side.
Okay. So there are people that remember that the Starbucks logo had a full crown on it. Mm-hmm. Right now, there's a star in the middle of the crown. There's not a what would you call it? Horn or something, whatever those little things on a crown is. So in actuality, it's always been a star on the crown. It's never been a full crown. I don't remember a star on the crown, but I don't also pass Starbucks or drink Starbucks regularly enough to pay attention to that. Something that we wouldn't know because it actually happened in London, that there's a dessert or a candy called Dib Dab. There's actually 13,000 people or more that believe that it was actually called, it's called Dip Dab, but people remember it being Dib Dab. 13,000 people or more remember it being Dib Dab. One that I have just seen recently and I didn't think about it is the Kit Kat logo. Mm-hmm. Do you remember it with or without a hyphen?
I remember. I swear I remember it with a hyphen.
There's no hyphen.
No hyphen. I know that. I know there's not because I just looked at a Kit Kat the other day.
Yeah. I remember it with a hyphen as well.
Mentioning that, yeah, I do remember it as a hyphen.
Cow tipping. You know what cow tipping is?
I know what cow tipping is, yes.
Do you know of anybody that has said they've gone cow tipping and actually succeeded?
I mean, not personally, but I seen videos of people cow tipping and succeeding. Supposedly, I'm going to say supposedly because I'm assuming you're about to just.
It's not a thing.
It's not a thing. Okay.
Yeah, it's physically impossible. I've never seen somebody actually do it. I've never heard of somebody actually do it. The only time I've ever remembered somebody attempting it was in Tommy Boy, a fictional thing. You know, but again, you would always hear about people talking about cow tipping and, you know, cows sleeping on their feet, and that's what makes it so easy to push them over. In actuality, cows sleep very lightly when they're sleeping on their feet. So that in and of itself, you would not be able to easily sneak up on a cow to do that.
So now, in my understanding, I never believed that someone could just walk up to a cow and tip it. I never even thought that was a thing. However, what I did understand, at least up until this point, I suppose, we'll see in a moment here what you say, is that people could scare a cow and that cow would seize up and tip over.
I've never heard of that. I've heard of fainting goats and that happening to them. I've never heard of a cow happening to a cow.
Okay. See, and that's interesting because that's how I've always, when it comes to cow tipping, that's what I always thought. And then there's this little known movie by Pixar called Cars. And in that show or in that movie, they come across some cows, car cows, and Mater honks his horn really loud and the cow goes moo and he flips up and falls back on his back. Basically, the cow gets tipped over as he got scared. And my entire life, that's what I thought happened. Like you can scare a cow so badly that it would just seize up, fall over, and boom, it's on its back until it gets pushed over. Or is no longer comatose, if you will.
Now, I'm sure there's those rare experiences, but everything I know about cattle, if there's any startling of a cattle, whether they're sleeping on their feet or not, their first instinct is to buck and stampede. I've never heard of it, but I'm sure it has happened where a cow has some type of disorder or is so startled that all of a sudden it just flops over, or if it's startled, it'll try and run fast and then slip and fall or something like that. And all of these that I'm reading right now are from a YouTube channel called All Time. And he had a list going back like 5 years. He had started 5 years ago doing Mandela effects. A lot of people believe that music videos started in the 1980s. I've never believed that because, I mean, there's music videos going all the way back to, Elvis and even before that, Buddy Holly. So actually, they started in the 1950s. And there was actually these machines that you could go to in cafes and bars and watch music videos, which I never knew. Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, I didn't know that either. No, I didn't believe that music videos started in the 80s. And honestly, it never even once crossed my mind as to when music videos started. So I can't say one way or the other. However, I will argue that the 1980s was probably the music video era, if you will, with MTV, especially in VH1, constantly playing music videos 24 hours a day. It was easy for people to have access to music videos on broad streaming, if you will, or in this case, I guess, broad television, live television, right? And so I think with that idea, with knowing that the 80s is kind of like the music video era, people just associated with music videos being invented at that time because of their popularity up through like the mid to late 90s. It's unfortunate that like VH1 and MTV no longer play music videos because that's what they were actually designed for. MTV's music television. That's what MTV stands for, and all they play is reality shows. VH1, I forget what that was called, video something. But again, it was associated primarily with music, and again, tends to play soap operas and reality movies or shows now. So. Weird.
Well, and even the guy that does this channel had admitted, I don't know if this is really a Mandela effect or people are just not realizing how far back music videos go. And you made a very valid point. MTV and VH1 brought it to the mainstream world of music videos. Mm-hmm. So I believe you were a fan of Pinky and the Brain as a kid, right?
Yep.
Okay. At any given point, Brain would say this phrase, Pinky, are you blank what I'm blanking? What did he say?
Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
No. That's what a lot of people do believe, but apparently it's, are you pondering what I'm pondering?
Okay.
And I mean, I'll give you the definition of pondering just so how people could have gotten confused. I remember it being, are you thinking what I'm thinking? Okay. However, the definition of pondering is to think about something carefully, especially before making a decision or reaching a conclusion.
Okay. I mean, I can't argue that that's a Mandela effect off per se, because I was so young at that point. I mean, by that I was like 13 years old, so not that young, but young enough to where a lot has happened since then. And trying to remember exactly what the words were used in that show, it's very possible that he said pondering, but being 13, I associated pondering with thinking, and therefore thinking is what stuck with me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I said, I remember it as thinking. That doesn't mean that it is the case, but with knowing the definition of what pondering is, it's a good possibility. We all thought it was one thing and not the other.
Right.
When you think of pyramids, what is your first association with pyramids?
Egypt.
Okay.
My first association. I know it's not. That's
not where we're going with it.
Okay, well, that's my first thought. Egypt. Even though Egypt is not the oldest pyramids in the world, they're also the most popular, the most famous.
So apparently, there's this belief out there that the Great Pyramids of Giza had hieroglyphs written inside of them. Mm. There's no hieroglyphs inside the Great Pyramids of Giza. Okay. Nor was there ever any treasures or mummies found in the Great Pyramids of Giza. I don't remember where they found King Tut, but I don't think it was the Great Pyramids of Giza. I think it was a different pyramid. The Alfred Hitchcock movie, The Birds. Do you remember it being in black and white or color?
Man, that's a tough one, because I remember very, very prominently that it was black and white, but I recently saw a video. It wasn't even a full video. It was just a clip. No words or music or anything that showed it as color. And I was like, I didn't know if they added color or if it has always been color. Because in my mind, it was just always black and white.
Okay. So here's the explanation. It was always in color. Okay. Most people believe that it was in black and white because back then, almost the majority of people had black and white TVs. Okay. They didn't go see it in theaters. They saw it as a rerun on TV. Okay. Even the main actress in that movie, forgot to write her name down, remembers people coming up to her saying that they remember it being in black and white. And she had to tell them, no, it was in color.
Yeah, see, so I mean, I think the argument that many people had black and white TVs back then, myself included. When I was growing up, my parents didn't have a black and white TV, and I remember our first color TV, which sadly, thinking back to that in this moment in 2024 and all the technology we have, I'm like, it blows my mind I actually existed in that time. I don't even, that might be a Mandela effect. I may not have actually been there. It's just somehow in my mind. But I'm going to also put this out there as a very subtle little, I don't know, maybe possibility of why people thought it was black and white. And that's because the bird, I'm going to feel like an idiot if this isn't right. What birds did they use in that movie?
I believe they were crows.
Were they crows? Mm-hmm.
Or ravens. They were a blackbird of some kind. But while you look that up, I'll continue this list for a second. So did you ever play Wii Sports?
Yes, I have.
What do you remember happening when you won on that game?
I don't know. I don't recall.
Okay, so a lot of people remember a voice coming on saying, "You win."
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
That never happened. It would only come on the screen, "You win." There was no voice associated with it.
Weird. I do remember the "you win." I'm going to jump back here with the birds. Yes, you're right. Some of the crows, which are also actually ravens, but presented as crows. However, there is a scene in which, very prominent in my mind, and this is something I think they often show in a lot of the trailers, is the seagulls that were used.
Okay.
Now, in my mind, whenever I think of the birds, I always think of seagulls around like whatever it was, that lighthouse or the house that the woman was in. And immediately I think when seeing, and it could be actually a combination of the crows and the seagulls, crows being, or ravens in this case, being fully black, and seagulls being a dark gray and white or a black and white. We naturally associate the color of the movie with the color of the birds, which were black and white, respectively.
That's a possibility too. I liked his explanation of the black and white TVs as well.
Well, I mean, his is probably right.
Well, it's a good possibility that people associated the color of the birds with it being black and white.
Yeah.
You can't tell with these Mandela effects because most people will remember one thing or another.
Right.
So this is a very odd one. I don't know if it's true or not, because I don't remember the boys well enough, but I guess there's this belief that in the beginning of Boys, like season 1, Homelander actually breastfeed on camera.
I mean, yes and no.
Well, Homelander actually never breastfed on camera until season 4.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying.
I forget the woman's name that he was infatuated with, the leader or the head of the Seven organization, feeds him breast milk on her fingers. Her blouse is unbuttoned, and it's believed that people just assumed that he was breastfeeding. But it does show the scene that she's actually feeding him with her fingers.
Okay. But how does that scene end? Like, do you recall?
They didn't show the final scene, and I can't remember it. It's been so long since I've
because I can't remember. Yeah, I mean, I'm on season 4 now. So season 1, if I remember correctly, I feel like she coddles him and then it cuts camera, which can lead to the assumption.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was close to her, and the way that they started the scene, he's laying in her lap, faced toward her breast. And then it cuts to a scene of her actually just feeding him with her fingers.
Got it. All the places we go on Paratruth. Weird things.
Another one we wouldn't really know because, again, this is something in England. Blue Ribbon candy bar is actually Blue Riband. Okay. And apparently people have been losing their mind over this.
I don't remember that.
There was even a show or a newscast that they were talking about this, and everybody's laughing that people are getting so upset about it. Well, in everybody's reality, if you tell them one thing is not what they remember, yeah, it kind of blows my mind too when I look at some of these Mandela effects. I mean, we had a very extensive conversation about the Berenstain versus the Berenstein, and I remember Berenstein. How far back do you recall skyscrapers being a thing?
I mean, I pretty much my whole life. So, do you mean like in general of history?
In general of history.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
So most people believe that they're more recent. They actually date back to medieval ages. There's actually 80 to 100 tower. There was 80 to 100 towers. And the reference he was talking about was in Italy. And there are several of these towers still in existence. Some people call them the Guardian Towers, for military purposes or whatever. But these buildings were much taller than the rest of buildings, and even in castles. So that's the reference to skyscrapers, because they aren't as tall as our skyscrapers today, is just a very tall building. And I mean, I never thought of those towers as skyscrapers.
Right.
However, there were several in this city in Italy. So that was kind of an interesting one.
Well, and so personally, like when I think of when I think of skyscrapers, the furthest back I can really think of is like the 1800s, because I was reading a book. I never finished the book because it was just too much what's the word? Architecture. It was too much about architecture, and I just started getting bored. But it was still fascinating because it was supposed to be the story of the Chicago World Fair, the first Chicago World Fair. Oh. But within the story of the World Fair and the architecture and all that, you also have America's first serial killer killing women, by the dozens. Not literally by the dozens, but many women. So jumping back and forth between the serial killer and the World Fair and the architecture, but it was just more about the architecture. And so with that said, one of the things that they talked about was how the person who had charge over the World Fair of Chicago wanted to build a tower that was greater than the tower that was built in France. Now, many had argued that was actually the Eiffel Tower that was built, that the guy built the Eiffel Tower there, which I think he did technically build a Eiffel Tower for the first World Fair in France. That's being one of the first that was at the time the tallest tower in the world. That was 1855, I believe. But it was, if I'm not mistaken, destroyed and then rebuilt in 1887 and has been existing there since 1887. So I don't know. When I think back to like skyscrapers and stuff, I'm thinking like the 1800s at the earliest, I suppose.
Okay. Well, yeah. Apparently they're way earlier. Way older.
Okay. I mean, the Tower of Babel in the Bible is legitimately ancient. Right. So I guess that could have been. It should have come to mind, I guess.
Right. Oh well. So the last one I came across for recent is the Wild West. When you think of the Wild West, what do you think of? Other than cowboys and Indians.
Dang, you took it, man. I mean, honestly, this is a bit sad. I think of Will Smith.
Okay, we'll just go into what I discovered. So apparently in the Wild West, there were camels roaming the Wild West.
Okay.
The U.S. Army actually introduced camels into the U.S. in 1865 to withstand the more treacherous desert areas in the U.S.
Makes sense.
Apparently 6 camels can do the work of 12 horses in those conditions specifically. There's actually a legend about apparently these feral camels running around attacking people.
Oh,
which we could probably look into that and do an episode on it.
Not horrifying at all.
Because there is one specific one where this camel was killing people and whatnot. So we'll have to go dig a little bit deeper. But that was the last Mandela effect that I came across that's more recent.
So the answer you were looking for is, what are horses? Right. Got it. The fascinating thing this is way off subject kind of, but I just recently listened to halfway through a multi-part series of a podcast about Ernest Shackleton, Sir Ernest Shackleton, as he is modernly known. But he ended up on one of his first expeditions to the Antarctic. He had dogs, sled dogs. These were husky-like dogs, very big, bred for cold weather and pulling things. However, they didn't take somebody to train the dogs, and they didn't have someone who can control the dogs, and they didn't bring enough food for the dogs. So they never used them to pull sleds because they didn't know how to train the dog to pull the sled, and they weren't giving him enough food. So they started losing weight and would die off as they progressed further into the Antarctica. As a result, he decided on his next expedition to Antarctica to bring ponies with him. Now, ponies roughly weigh about 800 pounds each. He thought this would be a great idea, and at the time it made sense. They can haul a lot more weight than the dogs could. They can, that's pretty much it. They could just move more stuff. Instead of the people doing it, they could do it. The problem was the horses ate almost half their weight in food daily, which means in order to have the horses, they had to bring more supplies for the food, which only built upon the weight that they were already dragging. And in this case, they were trying to make it to the South Pole. Now, this is hundreds and hundreds of miles on foot. As they were going, they actually lost a couple of these ponies in the crevices within the ice. Pony would put their hoof down, and they would go right through. And ultimately, by the time they ever made it even close to the South Pole, which they didn't, they made it to about 89. I think they made it to about 89 degrees and some odd minutes to the South Pole. But by the time they got there, all their ponies were dead, and they had to use them for meat, minus one who fell basically into oblivion, died instantaneously as it fell through. What they realized, or what we realized modernly, is that when you think about the choices you make on an expedition like that, taking a horse over dogs, even though dogs are, you have more of them and they're harder to train at times, they're actually built for the snow. They're lighter in weight. Their paws, because of the way they're built, they can expand upon the ice and distribute weight better than what these ponies can. They ate less, and therefore they can go further and travel more lightly over these crevices without falling through. Whereas a pony who doesn't know how to distribute weight would put all its weight down into one hoof and basically crack through the ground to its death. Just a fascinating little tidbit. I don't know. Camels made me think of it, but I thought it was interesting. Another little fact before we move on here, though, there are two things. The first, King Tut. That was something we brought up a little while ago. He was found in the belly of the kings of Egypt, which was Tatanakuami? Tatuhakanoman? I don't know. I don't know how to say that. So he was found in the belly of the kings of Egypt, which was not by the pyramids.
Okay.
It is actually located near the modern city of Luxor.
Okay.
And then final little interesting fact that I found regarding the birds, the movie. According to Alfred Hitchcock, they used 28,000 birds within that movie, out of which 3,200 of them were trained. 30 of those 28,000 birds, 3,200 of those 28,000 were trained. 30 of those 3,200 were endangered, considered special, or particularly special for that film, and only 4 of all 28,000 birds were consistently reliable enough to become leads within the movie.
Pretty interesting to think about an animal being a lead, but right? I mean,
Rin Tin Tin, Beethoven.
Oh, I Lassie, mean, a lot of them,
they're all leads,
right? That's pretty interesting. I think that pretty much wraps it up, unless there's anything else you wanted to cover.
No, I think we lost people a while ago.
All right, folks. Well, with that being said, ParaTruth is back. We're going to keep going strong with these different topics that we've talked about for so many years. As we mentioned, this show is going to be a little more of a seasonal thing. So maybe 10 to 12 episodes at the most, and we'll kind of take a break and then come back. So we got a little bit of ways before that happens. So stay tuned. We've got Halloween coming. We've got a lot of great topics to cover. But until next week, where you'll find us same time, same channel. My name is Justin.
I'm Eric. Peace.